So have you ever tried to explain what you believe to somebody and they just don't get it? Or you try and explain something you've seen and you say, you kind of come to the point where, I guess you just had to be there. Anybody else have that experience? So there's a common thread that goes through a lot of the resurrection stories. The people who are there, they go and tell somebody else, and they don't get it. The women at the tomb, they come and they tell the disciples that we went to the tomb and the tomb was empty, and these messengers of God, they appeared to us. These men, they appeared to us, and they said, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, he's risen." And they went back to the disciples, and what did the disciples say? They thought it was an idle tale. They didn't believe it. But Peter at least goes to the tomb and finds that it's empty. And then we have today the disciples are gathered together in the upper room, as John tells it. And Jesus appears to them, well, almost all of them. All except Thomas. And I know that Thomas has been doubting Thomas since this moment forward. And yet, if one of the disciples had walked up to you and you didn't have, years and years of being instructed in the faith and said, "Jesus is alive," you probably would have reacted in a similar way. Well, I want to see this. You got to see. I want to see. I want to understand what this is. And all I'm asking for is what you got. Jesus came and appeared among you and showed you his hands and his side. I want to see that too. I want to be a part of that too. And none of the, I'm going to tell you a little secret. So none of the apostles at that moment know exactly what this means. None of the apostles at that moment, the women at the tomb, when they come back and they say the tomb is empty, they don't know exactly what it means. They're still living in that, well, I don't know what this means, but something's changed. The disciples, Jesus appeared to them and shown them his hands and his side and has said, "Peace be with you," and they don't understand everything that means for them at that point. Thomas, when he finally is back that next week in the room and Jesus says, "Okay, put your hand here and put your finger here and put your hand here. Come, see my hands. Come look at my side." Even though he at that point can say, "My Lord and my God," I don't think he fully grasps everything that has happened at this moment in time. He's just overcome by, "You're here. You're present." And now what does this mean? What does this change? Because it's changed something. Dead people don't just get up from the grave and appear among you. Or unless that happens to you on a regular basis. It doesn't happen to me on a regular basis. I don't live in kind of an M. Night Shyamalan film with, for those who have seen The Sixth Sense, I see dead people. It's one of the lines of that film. I don't see dead people. So, for the disciples, this would have been something that they would not have understood all at once. And I'm going to tell you another little secret. So none of the New Testament is written before Jesus is resurrected. None of the New Testament is written before Jesus is resurrected. It's all written afterwards. And you want to know what? All of it is written from the perspective of Jesus is resurrected. What does this mean? So we're here at the end of John's Gospel. We're here at the end of John's Gospel where Jesus is risen and he appears to the disciples, he appears to Thomas, and then he gives us a little clue. Jesus did many more things than are written in this book. There are lots more that Jesus did that are not written in this book. But this here is written so that you may believe. So that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And you may have faith in him. And from this point, now there is one more chapter in the Gospel of John. It's another resurrection story. But everything in John's Gospel is read from this perspective. So how does John's Gospel begin? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. Now, The author of John did not, as the first time that Jesus was met, that was not what probably came to his mind. But in sitting and reflecting on who is this Jesus, he begins to realize more and more, who is this person that's been with me all this time? What does he mean? How does he impact things? And the reality is that Jesus is much more than what I thought he was. He's much more than just a teacher. He's much more than just a wise person. He's much more than just the Messiah. He's much more than I imagined he could have possibly been. And yet, most of us walk around and we try and make sense of what our eyes see, what our hands feel, what our senses experience. And I know that Jesus' disciples did that as they were walking around with him. There were lots of times where they didn't get it, where they didn't understand, because they didn't understand, they didn't have all the pieces to put it together yet. They needed that time. They needed to understand things in light of the resurrection, in light of Jesus coming and appearing to them, in light of light triumphing over darkness, life triumphing over death, good triumphing over evil. They needed to begin to make sense of things in light of this appearance. And you know what? Jesus never, in the resurrection stories, Jesus never berates the disciples for what they don't get, or what they don't understand at that moment. In every single one of the Gospels that tell about the resurrection, there's always this element of, in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, there's always this element of doubt or not understanding or not making sense of it yet. All of them have that. Whether it's the disciples, when Jesus first appears to them in John's Gospel, and then Jesus has to show them his hands and his side, and then they begin to rejoice. Or you have Thomas who, he's there, but he hasn't seen yet. And I want to see this. I want to experience this. And so what does Jesus do? He comes and he shows them and he experiences them. Now, I love Caravaggio's painting of this scene, but Thomas only asks to put his hand in his side or to put his finger in there. But when Jesus appears to him, Jesus offers that, but Thomas immediately jumps to, my Lord and my God. Okay, you show me. That's enough. And on the walk to Emmaus, which is which happens right after the gospel story that we heard last week on Easter, where the women have come back from the tomb, and then Peter runs to the tomb and goes and finds the tomb empty. And then we get the story of two disciples that are walking on the road to Emmaus, and they're talking among each other, and Jesus appears among them, but they're not able to understand that it's Jesus yet. They can't see that. They're somehow kept from seeing or kept from understanding who this is that's walking among them. And Jesus asks them, so what's happened? Why are you sad? And their response is, well, are you the only one who hasn't heard what's happened in these days? What's happened in Jerusalem? So Jesus asks them, well, what thing? And so they pour out their grief. Here was one who was, they say how they understood him. Here was a prophet, mighty in word and deed. And we had thought that he might be the Messiah. We had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. They had this vision of what Jesus could be. It wasn't all of who Jesus was, but they had this hope. And the reality is, I think that hope of what they thought Jesus would be had to die before they could understand who Jesus really was. And I think that sometimes that has to happen for us. One of the things I'm amazed at the way that the New Testament does this. The New Testament, almost every single book in the New Testament, and each book uses its own kind of language to talk about who Jesus is and what Jesus means. But every single book in the New Testament uses language for Jesus that has previously been reserved only for God. And so we heard from Revelation Day, the very beginning of Revelation. And we get this scene where, we're introduced, and Jesus is standing there and God is there. And we're introduced to both Jesus and God. And if you hear the echoes. It's, I am the one who is and who was and who is to come. Now, there's a little piece of this that if you don't know a little bit about the way God names God's self, this is also a reference back to the name of God. So when Jesus says, I am the one who is and who was and who is to come, anybody who's Jewish would have understood this is like, I don't know how many people would recognize this, but in John's Gospel, when the people come to arrest Jesus, and they say, are you Jesus of Nazareth? And he says, I am, and everybody falls to the ground. The reason that they do that, and anytime you hear in John's Gospel, I am the gate, I am the bread of life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that I am is also a reference back to the name of God. It's a claiming of, this is who I am. And so it's kind of a double play on words there, and we're invited to hear that all throughout the gospel. We're invited to hear it again and again throughout, for example, Revelation, where, God will say, I am the Alpha and the Omega. And then very shortly after, Jesus will say, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Okay, in Jesus, we're encountering something bigger than what we thought. We're encountering something that we hadn't expected. And yet all the Gospels have their own way of talking about it. In Matthew, it's Jesus is the Emmanuel. I am God with us, for example. But I think all of this is, we don't grasp this all at once. We get it kind of piece by piece. It's like putting together a puzzle, and the more pieces you get, the more the puzzle begins to make sense. And I do think that that's one of the reasons we come back again and again and again. That this Easter season is all about what John's Gospel is on. It's that you may have faith. It's that by coming to hear these things, you may come to understand that Jesus is the Messiah. But He's also the Son of God. And He's also more than what we grasp that He could possibly be. That we're invited on this journey again and again and again with the disciples as they make this journey with Jesus throughout His life, past His death, and then looking backwards, try and make sense of, well, what happened? So I'm going to guess that other people have this happen in their lives. You have something happen and it doesn't make sense, and then you look back 6 years later, or 7 years later, or a decade later, and it's like, oh, that's what was going on. Well, I think that the resurrection is like that. There is this moment where we understand something has changed. And then we go a little longer, and we walk, and we live out our faith, and we begin to put pieces together. And at some point we look back and we say, oh, so I understand this a little differently. I have a little bit fuller picture of what is going on now. I understand a little bit more of who this Jesus is and what He means for me. And there are many more things that could be said. There are many more things that could be said this day or any other day. But these things have been said that you may have faith. You may have believed that Jesus is the Christ. That Jesus is the Son of God. That in Jesus we have come in some way to meet God who is present among us. And that you may come through faith. Understand what that means. What Easter means for not only this day, but for the rest of your life. Thanks be to God. Amen.